After 50, silence starts sounding less like loneliness. I used to think wanting a girlfriend meant wanting connection. But somewhere along the years, connection quietly changed its weight. What once felt warm began to feel like something needing constant tending. At this age, you notice how peace arrives when nobody expects explanations. How evenings stretch without negotiation, without emotional weather to monitor. You realize how much of yourself was spent staying understandable. This isn't bitterness speaking, it's familiarity. The kind earned through repetition, compromise, and carefully chosen words. Turn most people never say aloud. Sometimes love isn't missing. Sometimes it has already finished teaching you what it could. And what remains is not emptiness. It's a steadiness you protect instinctively, without needing to justify why. Maybe that's why certain doors stay closed now. Not from fear, but from knowing exactly what they lead to. When companionship quietly becomes obligation. The quiet from earlier does not disappear once a relationship begins again. It simply changes shape, becoming something you manage instead of inhabit. After 50, companionship often arrives carrying invisible expectations, not spoken demands, but rhythms you are asked to adjust to. This is the first realization many men reach without announcing it. You notice how your days already have a fragile internal balance. Sleep, work, solitude, health, and silence hold each other in place. Adding another emotional center shifts that balance more than expected, not because the other person is difficult or unreasonable, but because shared life requires ongoing emotional attendance. You start sensing how often your inner quiet gets postponed. Small negotiations, tone adjustments, emotional check-ins, all well-intended, none harmful, yet none entirely free either. And slowly, a question forms beneath the surface. Is this connection restoring me, or quietly asking me to rearrange myself again? The shift from mutual choice to emotional management. At this stage, relationships rarely begin from blank emotional ground. They arrive layered with histories, habits, and unspoken survival patterns. What once felt like choosing each other slowly becomes managing two emotional systems. This isn't about conflict or incompatibility, it's about maintenance. You notice how conversations now include invisible monitoring. What mood is she in today? How much space is safe to take? Which parts of yourself need softening to keep equilibrium? None of this is dramatic. That's what makes it heavy. You realize how often connection now requires preemptive adjustment. Not lies, not suppression, just constant calibration. A gentle self-editing that never fully turns off. Over time, you feel the difference between presence and performance, between being chosen and being emotionally useful. And a quieter question begins forming underneath everything. At this age, do I want to be understood again, or finally allowed to remain unadjusted? How long experience changes the meaning of intimacy. With time, intimacy stops being mysterious and starts becoming familiar terrain. You recognize the patterns before they fully form, the closeness, the merging, the subtle erosion of personal edges. This isn't cynicism. It's memory working quietly in the background. You remember how intimacy once felt expansive, even intoxicating. Now it feels precise, consequential, something that alters internal structures. Every shared routine replaces a private one you had carefully built. You become aware of how deeply your nervous system values predictability now. Late nights, spontaneous talks, emotional intensity land differently than before. What once energized you now requires recovery afterward. You don't reject closeness, you simply feel its cost more clearly in the body. And a different question begins to surface without urgency. Is intimacy still about discovery? Or has it become an exchange I already understand too well? The invisible cost of adjusting a life already integrated. By this point, your life is no longer experimental. It is assembled, calibrated, quietly holding together. Habits interlock for reasons you no longer need to explain. You wake, move, eat, rest, and recover with intention now. Not ambition, preservation. Introducing someone new doesn't add a chapter. It rewrites margins everywhere at once. Schedules bend, spaces shift, silence gets reinterpreted. None of it feels dramatic from the outside. That's what makes the cost invisible. You feel it when routines loosen slightly, then never fully return. When energy goes toward adaptation instead of restoration. When small compromises accumulate into a constant background hum. You're not protecting comfort, you're protecting coherence. And a careful thought begins forming without resistance. How much reshaping can a settled life absorb before it stops feeling like home? Why solitude at this stage feels different, not empty. After years of shared space, solitude no longer feels like absence. It feels like a return to an internal rhythm you recognize immediately. The quiet lands faster now, without needing to be filled. This kind of solitude isn't withdrawal, it's familiarity. You notice how your thoughts move without interruption, how emotions rise and settle without explanation or negotiation. Nothing pulls at your attention asking to be managed. The body responds first. Breathing slows. Sleep deepens. Recovery happens without effort. You realize solitude now gives something relationships once provided. A sense of alignment. A feeling of being intact rather than divided. It's not that you stopped wanting connection. You stopped confusing presence with peace. And a softer question begins forming underneath the calm. If solitude restores me this completely, what exactly would I be giving up? Emotional autonomy. After decades of relational learning, by now, your emotional world no longer feels uncharted. You know what destabilizes you and what quietly restores balance. That knowledge didn't come from theory. It came from years of living through emotional cycles. This is where autonomy begins to feel essential, not ideal. You notice how self-regulation has become internal, almost automatic. Moods rise and fall without needing to be processed aloud. You've learned when to sit with feelings instead of externalizing them. In relationships, this autonomy often gets misunderstood. Calm is mistaken for distance. Independence reads like withdrawal. But inside, there is clarity rather than avoidance. A sense of emotional ownership you worked hard to develop. One that doesn't want to be negotiated back into shared custody. You're not guarding against closeness. You're protecting an inner system that finally runs without interference. And a careful question begins forming without urgency. If emotional autonomy took decades to build, who would I need to become to share it again? Choosing stability over repair in the second half of life. At some point, you stop mistaking repair for growth. You've done enough fixing, enough revisiting, enough careful rebuilding. Stability begins to feel like an earned state, not a lack of courage. This doesn't mean nothing inside you is broken. It means you no longer center your life around fixing dynamics. You recognize how relationships often reopen old maintenance roles. The listener, the stabilizer, the one who absorbs tension quietly. Earlier in life, that felt meaningful. Now it feels expensive. You notice how peace holds when nothing needs immediate attention, when no emotional systems require constant tuning, when your energy stays where your life already stands. Choosing stability isn't giving up on connection. It's choosing not to organize your future around repair again. And a final thought settles without drama. At this stage, what I protect may matter more than what I pursue. What all this points to isn't rejection of love. It's recognition. Recognition of how much inner structure it took to arrive here intact. Of how carefully your life now supports your nervous system, not your image. Of how silence, once feared, has become a form of alignment. This isn't about age. It's about accumulation. Experiences layered long enough to teach discernment without bitterness. Choices shaped by consequence, not optimism or avoidance. A preference for steadiness that no longer needs justification. Some paths close because they failed. Others close because they worked exactly as intended. And what remains is not withdrawal. It's a quieter loyalty to the life you finally understand how to sustain.